James had always been wary of family dinners with Victoria, his mother-in-law. The woman had a way of looking at him as though he were an intruder, someone who didn't belong in the picture she'd meticulously crafted for her daughter, Isabella. Victoria was the epitome of control. Her smile was always too perfect, her voice too calculated. Every time James walked into her home, he felt like a guest in a world that didn't fully accept him. It wasn't just the tension between them that made him uneasy. It was the subtle power plays, little comments about his career, his lack of a real job by her standards, or the way she subtly undermined his decisions around Isabella. James wasn't the kind of guy who would ever take that lying down. But with Victoria, it was hard to push back. She was too clever. Tonight, the family was gathering at her house for what she called a special celebration. When he heard that, he wasn't sure whether to be worried or just annoyed. The whole idea sounded like another one of her attempts to control the narrative. But Isabella was excited. It had been a while since they'd all been together as a family, and despite Victoria's coldness, James didn't want to disappoint his wife. "So, what's the occasion?" James asked, picking at his food in their apartment while Isabella got ready. She shrugged. She didn't say, but you know how Mom is. Always making a big deal out of nothing. James smiled, appreciating Isabella's laid-back nature. But deep down he had this nagging feeling that something wasn't right. He couldn't shake the thought that Victoria was planning something more than just a dinner. There was always an underlying motive with her. The dinner started off predictably enough. The grand dining room of Victoria's mansion was decorated in a style that screamed wealth, but felt cold and sterile. Every chair was perfectly aligned, the silverware shining brightly under the dim chandelier. It was the kind of place that made James feel more like an outsider than ever. Isabella's warm smile did little to ease the tension between him and Victoria. As usual, she wore a pleasant, almost too perfect expression as she greeted him with that false cheer. "James, I'm so glad you could join us tonight," Victoria said, though her eyes didn't seem to match her words. "Of course. Thanks for having me," James replied, his voice measured. As they sat down to dinner, he couldn't help but notice how calculated everything seemed. Even the food was pristine, an expensive cut of steak garnished with perfect greens. James had never been one for pretentious meals, but he ate it all the same, trying to ignore the strange, almost predatory way Victoria was looking at him. It was when she poured the wine that his unease began to rise. Victoria took the bottle and expertly poured a glass for each person at the table, but when she reached for James's glass, she paused for a moment. Their eyes met, and for the briefest second, James felt a jolt of discomfort. It was a strange, fleeting moment, but it was enough to make him wary. "Let me," she said smoothly, offering him the glass with a polite but cool smile. James didn't think much of it at first. But as he took the glass, something inside him shifted. His instincts told him something wasn't right. It wasn't like Victoria to do anything so openly generous. It felt like a subtle test, a game she was playing. He casually glanced at Isabella, who was laughing with her father at the other end of the table, and then back at the glass in his hand. Something about it felt off. Victoria watched him closely as he raised the glass to his lips. Her smile didn't falter, but there was something cold behind it. A glint of satisfaction almost. James couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a simple family dinner. He set the glass down for a moment, pretending to reach for the breadbasket, and glanced across the table. Victoria was still watching him, but this time it was with a subtle intensity, as if waiting for him to take that first sip. The conversation carried on around him, but James wasn't listening. His thoughts were focused entirely on the glass in front of him. It had been a long day at work, and he felt an unusual fatigue creeping up on him, but the nagging sense that something was wrong kept him alert. He hadn't felt this way before, not even after all the awkward dinners with Victoria. Victoria's husband, Charles, was sitting to her right, chatting with Isabella's father. James noticed Charles's glass of wine was still half full, which was strange because the man was usually a heavy drinker. Then, the opportunity presented itself. As the conversation turned toward business and finances, something Victoria always loved to discuss in front of everyone, James's mind wandered. Without thinking too much, he subtly swapped his glass with Charles, pretending to adjust his seat. It was a simple move, a quiet gesture, but it felt like he was taking control of something in an environment that had always made him feel powerless. He couldn't explain why, but the decision felt right. Seconds later, he picked up Charles's glass, taking a sip while the conversation continued around him. He tried to act normal, but his nerves were on edge. It was then that he noticed the subtle shift in Charles's demeanor. The older man had started to look a little flushed, his speech slowing down, his eyes growing distant. Victoria was still talking, but now she was focused on Charles, a look of genuine concern. Too concerned, James thought, flashing across her face. About 20 minutes later, the atmosphere at the table began to shift. Charles suddenly slumped forward in his chair, his hand gripping the edge of the table. The glasses in front of him tipped over as he slid sideways. "Charles?" Victoria's voice was sharp, panicked. It all happened so quickly. 1 second, Charles had been talking, laughing even, and the next, he was collapsing. "Call an ambulance," Victoria screamed, her composure slipping for the first time in as long as James had known her. Isabella rushed to her father's side, and her mother quickly followed. The rest of the guests, including James, stood in stunned silence. The noise of the room seemed to vanish as the gravity of the situation hit them all. James stayed frozen for a moment. His mind raced. What had just happened? Was Charles having a heart attack, or something else? But something was off. Something didn't sit right. He looked at Victoria, whose hands were shaking as she held Charles, but her eyes darted toward James. The look was subtle, but it was there. It wasn't concern, it was something else, something darker. A warning. Almost like she knew exactly what had happened. And then it hit him. He had swapped glasses with Charles. The glass he'd taken a sip from had just been poisoned. The next few hours were a blur. An ambulance had arrived, and Charles was rushed to the hospital. Though no one could explain why or how he'd collapsed so suddenly, Victoria was beside herself, frantically calling doctors and making arrangements, her composure completely shattered for the first time in James's memory. Isabella, equally frantic, was by her father's side. James remained in the background, pretending to be just as concerned as everyone else. But beneath the surface, his mind was racing. He had done it. He had swapped the glasses, and he had tasted the wine, the one Victoria had poured herself. There was no doubt in his mind now. The look in her eyes had confirmed it. Victoria had poisoned her husband. But why? And why had she done it so publicly? The rest of the evening passed in a haze of unanswered questions and unspoken suspicions. Victoria's house, once filled with laughter and idle chatter, now felt like a haunted, empty space. It was as if the very air was charged with danger. The following morning, James found himself standing in the kitchen, staring blankly at the coffee pot. Isabella had stayed with her father at the hospital, and Victoria had disappeared into her study, presumably to make more calls. It gave James the perfect opportunity to think, to plan. He knew this wasn't a simple case of a bad drink or a freak accident. Victoria wasn't the kind of woman to make a mistake like that. No, this had been calculated. James had long suspected Victoria's dislike of him, but now he had proof that she was willing to go to extreme lengths to control the family's fortunes and perhaps even drive him out of the picture entirely. But why go after Charles? What could she possibly gain by poisoning her own husband? He sat down, his mind reeling. There was only one way to find out the truth. He had to confront Victoria. But this time, it wouldn't be a simple exchange of words. This time, James would play the game. By the time James entered Victoria's study later that day, he had already made up his mind. He needed answers, and he was going to get them, no matter the cost. Victoria was sitting behind her desk, as composed as ever, her hands resting calmly on a stack of papers. She didn't look up when he entered, not at first. "I need to speak with you," James said, his voice steady but hard. Victoria's eyes flicked up briefly, a quick flash of recognition crossing her face, but then it disappeared. Just as fast. I'm very busy, James. I don't have time for another one of your accusations. Accusations? James couldn't keep the bitterness from creeping into his voice. You think I'm accusing you of something? Victoria's eyes narrowed. She tilted her head slightly, as if she were studying him. I know what you're going to say, but I won't tolerate any more of your paranoia. My husband is in the hospital because of a medical emergency, and I expect you to behave like a decent human being for once. James stepped closer, his eyes fixed on hers. Don't play dumb, Victoria. I know what you did. For a moment there was silence, heavy and oppressive. Victoria didn't blink, didn't even flinch. She simply stared at him, as if weighing her options. I don't know what you think you know, she said finally, her voice almost too calm. But if you're implying that I poisoned my husband, then you are gravely mistaken. James clenched, his jaw fighting the urge to raise his voice. He couldn't afford to lose control now. I swapped glasses with Charles last night. I drank the same wine he did, and I know it was you who poisoned it. Victoria's expression remained unchanged, though her hands curled into tight fists on the desk. You think I would be so foolish as to poison my own husband at a family dinner? Her voice was cold now, with a sharp edge that sent a chill down James's spine. You didn't care about that, James shot back. You cared about getting rid of him, and getting rid of me. Victoria stood slowly, her eyes flashing with a mixture of anger and something darker, something much more dangerous. You don't know what you're talking about, she said, in a low, almost venomous tone. But you will soon enough. That night James couldn't sleep. His mind kept replaying the confrontation, the strange glint in Victoria's eyes, and the way she had so expertly deflected his accusations. But there was something else, something he couldn't shake. Her words haunted him. You will soon enough. What had she meant by that? Was she threatening him? Or was she trying to warn him about something even more dangerous? He couldn't let this go. Not now. He needed to dig deeper, uncover the truth. He began his own investigation, starting with Charles's medical records and the family's financial documents, hoping to find something, anything that would reveal Victoria's true intentions. It wasn't long before he found the first piece of the puzzle. Hidden in a series of old bank statements were transfers. Large sums of money moved to offshore accounts under Victoria's name. But the transactions weren't random. They seemed to follow a pattern, one that matched the timing of every major financial decision Charles had made in the past year. Then there was the inheritance. James had always known that Victoria held a significant amount of control over the family fortune, but now it seemed that she had been manipulating Charles in ways James had never suspected. Charles had made some odd decisions over the years, but nothing that would explain the current situation. Now James was beginning to understand. Victoria had been setting Charles up. Poisoning him wasn't an accident. It was part of a larger scheme, a plan to push him out of the way and to take full control of the family's wealth. And James was the next obstacle. The more James uncovered, the darker the truth became. Victoria wasn't just trying to poison Charles. She was trying to erase him entirely from the picture. The offshore accounts, the hidden assets, everything pointed to a carefully constructed plan to have Charles declared mentally incompetent and to take over his fortune. And now, with Charles out of the way, she was setting her sights on James. But James wasn't going to sit back and let her win. In the days that followed, he devised a plan of his own, a dangerous game that would force Victoria's hand. He knew he couldn't confront her directly. Not yet. But he could manipulate the situation, turn the tables on her. He gathered evidence, more documents, photos, and recordings, setting up a web that would entrap her. He didn't trust anyone, not even Isabella. She was too close to her mother, too loyal. James knew he couldn't risk exposing everything just yet, but the day was coming when he would have to. And when he did, Victoria's world would come crashing down. James spent the next few days like a man on a mission, gathering information, piecing together the threads of Victoria's plan. and making sure his every move was calculated. It wasn't just about proving her guilt now. It was about taking her down before she could take everything from him and Isabella. He began with the family's legal documents, wills, trust funds, and anything related to inheritance. Everything seemed designed to favor Victoria. If Charles ever went missing or was deemed incapacitated, she would have full control of the estate. James had long known that Victoria was manipulative, but this was something else entirely. She'd been preparing for this moment for years. Late one night, James sat in front of his computer scanning old legal files when a particular name caught his attention. Catherine Greenfield. The name was listed as a beneficiary in several of the trust documents, but James had never heard it before. He jotted it down, feeling a sudden curiosity rise in him. Why would Victoria leave part of her wealth to a name he didn't recognize? The next morning, James went to the local library and started digging into the name. It wasn't long before he found an article buried deep in a digital archive. Catherine Greenfield was a former business partner of Charles, someone who had been involved with the family's financial dealings years ago. But the article didn't just mention her in a business context. It revealed that she had disappeared under mysterious circumstances, her sudden vanishing coinciding with a major deal the family had made in the past. James's heart raced. This was the missing piece he'd been searching for. It all started to fall into place. Victoria wasn't just trying to poison Charles for control. She had been trying to erase him from the family's history altogether, just as she had erased Catherine from the picture years ago. What if Victoria had been responsible for Catherine's disappearance? And what if Catherine had known something that could expose Victoria for who she really was? James spent the next few days retracing Catherine's steps, trying to find out what had really happened to her. He contacted old colleagues, business associates, and even private investigators who had worked on the case back then. What he discovered shocked him. Catherine had been working on a deal with Victoria that involved transferring large sums of money to foreign accounts. The deal had gone sour, and Catherine had threatened to go public with what she knew about Victoria's financial manipulation. And then she was gone. The police report listed it as an unsolved disappearance, but the circumstances surrounding it made it clear that foul play was involved. There was no evidence linking Victoria to Catherine's disappearance directly, but the timing was damning. James couldn't believe it. He had always suspected Victoria was hiding something, but this was bigger than he had imagined. He had to act quickly. The more he uncovered, the more dangerous his position became. He was playing a game with a woman who was capable of anything. As the days passed, James's plan took shape. He knew he couldn't confront Victoria directly, at least not yet, but he could find a way to bait her into making a mistake. One evening, he invited Victoria to meet him at a quiet bar downtown. The location was secluded, private enough to avoid unwanted attention, yet public enough to avoid any suspicion. When she arrived, her usual calm, controlled demeanor was absent. She looked tense, almost like a predator who had sensed a threat lurking nearby. "James, this better be important," Victoria said, sliding into the seat across from him. Her eyes were narrowed, her hands resting on the table, poised for action. "It is," James replied, leaning forward slightly. "I think you and I both know that Charles isn't the only one who's been keeping secrets, Victoria." She didn't flinch, but the slight tightening of her jaw was enough to tell him he'd hit a nerve. "You've been digging, haven't you?" James smiled darkly. "I have, and I found something interesting. Catherine Greenfield. You remember her, don't you?" The mention of Catherine's name caused something in Victoria's eyes to flicker. For just a moment, the mask slipped. She didn't even try to hide her surprise. "Catherine has nothing to do with this," she said coldly, though James could hear the faint tremor in her voice. "I beg to differ," James replied. "You've been trying to erase people for years. Victoria, first Catherine, now Charles, and soon me. But I'm not going down without a fight." Victoria's expression hardened. "You're playing a dangerous game, James, but it's too late to back out now. You've already made your, move." James didn't flinch. "I'm just getting started." Over the next few days, James carefully set his trap. He arranged for anonymous tips about Victoria's financial dealings to reach the authorities. He planted a few seeds in the right places, making sure that anyone who looked into her past would eventually find the dark underbelly of her life. Meanwhile, he kept up the charade in front of Isabella, trying to maintain a semblance of normalcy. But he could feel the walls closing in. Victoria wasn't just trying to control the family. Fortune, she was trying to destroy him. And if he wasn't careful, he could end up like Catherine Greenfield, erased from the family's history as though he had never existed. But James wasn't going to let that happen. Not without a fight. The night of the family's next gathering arrived, and James could feel the tension building. Victoria knew he was onto her. He could see it in her eyes whenever they exchanged a glance. She knew that her carefully constructed empire was beginning to unravel. Isabella could sense it too. "James, what's going on?" she asked quietly as they stood by the kitchen. "I can tell something's wrong. You're not the same lately." James looked at her, his heart heavy with the weight of his secrets. "I'm trying to protect you, Isabella, and I'm trying to protect us. From your mother." Her eyes widened, a mix of disbelief and concern in them. "What do you mean?" James hesitated, the words feeling heavy in his mouth. "I think your mother's been manipulating all of us, for years, and I'm going to stop her before she destroys everything." Isabella took a step back, her face pale. "What are you saying? Are you accusing her of—" "Yes," James said quietly. "I think your mother is behind everything. The poison, the disappearances, the lies. And I can't let her win." The days following their conversation were a blur for James. He could feel the walls closing in on him, as if he were walking on a tightrope stretched thin above an abyss. The truth about Victoria was slowly but surely being pieced together, but he knew the closer he got, the more dangerous it would become. Victoria was no longer hiding her suspicion. Her eyes followed him everywhere, and she was noticeably more hostile in their interactions. Yet she didn't make any overt threats. She didn't need to. Victoria was playing the long game, letting the tension simmer under the surface, waiting for James to make a mistake. One evening, as James sat alone in the study, staring at the growing stack of evidence, his phone buzzed. It was a message from an anonymous number. "The police have started looking into you, James. You're not as careful as you think." His heart skipped a beat. James immediately deleted the message, but the unease remained. He had expected Victoria to try something, maybe a few rumors here and there, but this was different. The mention of the police meant that she was no longer playing games. She had gone on the offensive. For the first time, James began to wonder if he had overplayed his hand. The pressure was mounting. Victoria's tactics were becoming more aggressive. James noticed her slipping more subtle jabs into their conversations, casual threats disguised as innocent remarks. He knew she was trying to get under his skin to make him panic, but James wasn't about to back down. If anything, he was more resolute now. He had uncovered too much, and he wasn't going to let her walk away unscathed. Not after what she had done to Charles, and certainly not after what she had tried to do to him. He continued his investigation, digging deeper into the family's finances, and the more he uncovered, the more revolting the truth became. There were multiple offshore accounts, all tied to shell companies with money flowing in and out like a river. These accounts were hidden from everyone, including Isabella. James knew she had no idea how deep her mother's web of lies and deceit ran. Victoria had been using the family fortune as her personal slush fund for years, and now it was all coming to a head. But it wasn't just about money. Victoria had a secret, one she had been hiding from everyone, even Charles. James stumbled upon a series of encrypted files in her private email account. It took him several hours, but eventually he was able to decrypt the files, revealing a dark secret. Victoria had been involved in an illegal arms deal several years ago. She had used the family business as a front, laundering money and facilitating transactions with dangerous individuals. The implications were staggering. If this information were to get out, it would destroy her, but it would also destroy the family. James felt sick to his stomach as he scrolled through the files, realizing just how far Victoria had gone to protect her empire. She wasn't just a ruthless manipulator, she was a criminal. James knew he was running out of time. The walls were closing in on him, and the more he dug, the more dangerous it became. He had to act before Victoria destroyed everything, and before she turned the tables on him. It was during one of their family dinners, the usual tension hanging thick in the air, that James decided to confront Victoria once and for all. Isabella was sitting beside him, oblivious to the storm brewing around them. Charles was still recovering in the hospital, but Victoria had insisted on hosting another dinner in his absence. James had the feeling that she wanted to keep up appearances, to remind everyone that she was still in control. But James wasn't going to let her have that control anymore. As the meal came to a close, and the guests began to disperse, James stayed behind. He knew this was his moment. Victoria was in the kitchen preparing herself a drink. She didn't look up as James approached her, but she felt his presence. Her back stiffened. "You're making a mistake," she said softly, as if she were speaking to herself. "I think you've made plenty of mistakes," James replied, his voice calm but cold. "And I'm done letting you hide behind your lies." Victoria turned to face him, her eyes narrowed in suspicion. "What do you mean by that?" "I mean," James said, stepping closer, "I know everything. About Catherine Greenfield, the money transfers, the arms deals. I know about the poison you slipped into Charles's drink, and I know why you did it." For a moment there was silence. Victoria's face was unreadable, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of something. Fear, perhaps, or maybe anger. "You're a fool, James," she said finally, her voice low. "You think you can just expose me and get away with it?" James took a deep breath. "I think you've underestimated me. You've underestimated us." Victoria smirked, her lips curling into a thin line. "You're just like your father, always thinking you can control everything. But you're wrong. I've been preparing for this moment for years. You've been playing into my hands, James." James felt a chill run down his spine. "What are you talking about?" "You think you've been pulling the strings, uncovering all these secrets, but you've walked right into my trap," Victoria said, her smile widening. "You've been so focused on exposing me that you didn't see the bigger picture. You're not just in danger, Isabella is in danger too." James froze. "What do you mean?" "Isabella is the key to everything. She's the one I've been protecting all these years, but now—" Victoria's eyes gleamed with cold, calculating intent. "Now I'm going to make sure she's mine, just like everything else in this family." The threat was real. Victoria wasn't just playing a game anymore, she had shifted into full-on survival mode. She wasn't going to let James destroy her carefully crafted empire, even if it meant dragging everyone down with her. James knew he had to act fast. He couldn't risk Victoria taking control of Isabella. He couldn't let her manipulate his wife the way she had manipulated everyone else. But he wasn't going to back down either. The final confrontation between James and Victoria was inevitable. One way or another, the truth would come out. And when it did, everything would change. The days after their confrontation weighed heavily on James. He could feel the intensity building as the final pieces of the puzzle fell into place. Victoria had underestimated him, and now he knew exactly what he needed to do. He couldn't let her have control over Isabella any longer. James worked tirelessly, gathering his final evidence, preparing to expose the truth. He contacted his lawyer and set up a meeting with the authorities, making sure everything was in place. He had to make sure that Victoria's manipulations, her crimes, and her years of deceit wouldn't go unpunished. But he knew that exposing her would only be the beginning. There was no turning back after this. The night of the final showdown arrived. James had planned everything meticulously. He knew exactly when and how he would strike. The police were already on standby, and his lawyer was ready to present the overwhelming evidence of Victoria's criminal activities. Victoria, as always, was confident in her position. She believed she had James right where she wanted him, but James had learned enough to know that she was vulnerable. He wasn't going to fall into her traps anymore. As the family gathered for another dinner, James kept his eyes on Victoria. She had been playing her game for so long, pretending to be the perfect matriarch of the family, but now her mask was slipping. Her facade of control was faltering, and James could feel it. The atmosphere was thick with tension as the dinner progressed. James could tell that something was about to happen. Victoria was on edge, her movements sharper, her eyes darting around the room. She was waiting for the inevitable confrontation, but she wasn't going to back down without a fight. James stood up, his voice cutting through the conversation. "I have something to say," he declared, his tone firm. Everyone fell silent, turning their attention to him. Victoria's face remained unreadable, but James could see the tension in her shoulders. She knew what was coming. He pulled out a folder from his briefcase and slid it across the table toward her. "You've been hiding the truth from all of us, Victoria, for years, but I'm done being your pawn." Victoria's eyes narrowed. "What is this?" "It's your downfall," James replied, his voice unwavering. "This is everything you've done. The money transfers, the illegal deals, the poisoning, and the disappearance of Catherine Greenfield. I have it all, and now I'm taking it to the authorities." For a moment, there was complete silence in the room. Victoria's face drained of color, but she quickly regained her composure. "You think you can ruin me, James?" she hissed, her voice low but filled with venom. "You don't understand what you're dealing with." "I understand perfectly," James shot back. "I've spent months uncovering the truth, and now it's over. You're finished." Victoria stood abruptly, her chair scraping across the floor. "You're making a huge mistake," she spat, her eyes flashing with rage. "You're nothing but a fool." But before she could make another move, the door opened and 2 police officers stepped inside. They had been waiting outside, ready to act on the information James had provided. The authorities had already been briefed on the situation, and the evidence was irrefutable. Victoria froze, her face paling as the officers approached her. "You're under arrest for multiple charges, including fraud, poisoning, and conspiracy to commit murder," one of the officers said. James watched as the woman who had terrorized his life for so long was taken away in handcuffs. There was no more control, no more manipulation. It was over. In the weeks that followed, life began to return to some semblance of normalcy. Victoria was arrested and the legal process moved quickly, with the evidence James had gathered leading to her eventual conviction. The family was in shock, trying to process the enormity of what had just happened. Isabella struggled with the truth, but she eventually came to terms with the betrayal of her mother. James stood by her side through it all, offering his support and love. He had fought for her, for their future, and now they could begin to rebuild their lives. As for Charles, he was slowly recovering from the poisoning, and though his health was still fragile, he was grateful to James for exposing the truth. The family's wealth had been temporarily frozen during the investigation, but in the end, the truth had set them free. James knew there was still a long road ahead. The scars of betrayal would take time to heal, but they had made it through the storm together. Months later, James and Isabella sat together on the porch of their home watching the sunset. It had been a turbulent journey, but they had come out stronger on the other side. Victoria was behind bars, and the family had begun to rebuild. Charles was starting to regain his strength, and Isabella had begun to heal from the emotional scars that her mother had left behind. James turned to Isabella, his heart swelling with pride. "We made it," he said softly. Isabella smiled, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "We did, together." And as the sun dipped below the horizon, they both knew that the future, though uncertain, was theirs to shape. The past was finally behind them. The end